in this battle, he basically sacrifices himself and winds up dying the way those people went just before his ship is saved by somebody else. But yeah, I thought, you want to make it a significant character death meaningful with a long backstory that feeds into it. I mean, it may not be him throwing himself on a grenade, like you said, but it should be something that's been built up to, I think, in the plot. It shouldn't come as like, I mean, it should be a surprise, but it shouldn't be
It's
something
inevitable.
yeah, it shouldn't be something when people read it that they can't look back and see, oh yeah, this was being built up to, and I just didn't see it at the time.
Troopers fall through an endless sky. Military sound and science fiction contest. We enter the system on fire. Military sound and science fiction contest. Told stories every Wednesday. Military sound and fiction contest.
Welcome to the Military Science Fiction Podcast. We are four veterans who are crazy enough to become writers, and we're here to talk about what makes great military SF, the greatest niche within a niche of any fiction, more niche than the Space Force. On board is Rick Partlow, author of more than 60 novels, including Contact Front and the Drop Trooper series, Jeffrey H. Haskell, author of the Grimm's War series, as well as the Wraith and Arsenal superhero series, Josh Hayes, author of the Valor series, and now what's the newest one that came out that's on Audible that folks should go check out?
Audible exclusive, right?
Navarro's Chronicles.
Chronicles.
It's not technically audio exclusive, but it is just in audio right now. It'll be in paperback in probably like 2 weeks.
Oh, nice. And I am James Stiegel, author of the Aeon 14 Sentience Wars series and the Galactic Law series. Between the four of us, we bring more than 100 novels written, although most of that is Rick, more than 30 years publishing experience, and on the military side would be retired by now if any of us had stuck around. Today, we are talking about death in military science fiction, and necessarily how you create stakes, how you give it meaning, should you drag it out, what's the best death that you remember for a character, how many people should your characters kill?
All the people.
All the people. Could you have a Star Trek military science fiction novel in a future where no one dies? Would that be interesting? So I don't know. Who's got some thoughts about this? Who wants to start? Who has a hot take?
Death is kind of an interesting thing in all of fiction, because it can either be done very well or very badly. I don't know that I've come across a death that was like meh. But I think, especially in like the written word, people watch too many Avengers movies, and then they want to have battles with thousands and thousands and thousands of characters, and there's just no way to do anything with fiction that way, especially when a lot of people are dying and keeping track of all that. If I'm going to, obviously you're going to have the faceless stormtroopers that you're going to kill off, and you're going to have the cannon fodder or whatever. But when it comes to character death, I have two takes. One, they're polar opposite. One, if they're going to die, make it meaningful, or if they're going to die, make it plausible. Don't just kill them to kill them. I had a character in my Tranquility books that if the books would have done better, I didn't want to kill. I wanted her to. You guys remember the game StarCraft?
Mm-hmm.
From back in the 90s. So it was kind of like a blend of StarCraft and Titanfall, and the Zerg equivalent, the aliens, they had a hive mind, and I had one of the female characters kind of through a series of infections and different things. Yeah, basically she was going to be my Kerrigan, and I was like, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to take her to these different places and do all of that. Well, when it was time to end it, it only lasted for 3. I didn't know what I could do with her because I hadn't planned to kill her off. And the only real thing that I could do with it to actually end the trilogy and just finish it was to kill her off. And so I made her have to do like basically a one-on-one kind of mental gymnastics fight with the Hive Overlord, big bad, and then she took over the Hive, and then she kills herself to kill the Hive. And it was kind of a big dramatic
Spoiler
thing,
alert.
and yeah. Well, it's been out for a while. But
Did you have a moment? You said it was you said it was Cross of Titanfall. Remember the robot in Titanfall 2?
I did not
P109 or whatever.
have.
He was so cool. That Titanfall 2 is one of the best story games I've ever
I
played.
love the Titanfall series, but based all the mechs off of Titanfall, but the mechs that I used, I set them up as construction mechs, and then they were like added on to make them
Repurposed,
battle
yeah.
mechs. Yeah. But they didn't have any AI or anything. They couldn't operate independently.
Gotcha.
But anyway, so that death was not, it was unexpected. But I wanted to make it meaningful to end the series. But there are some deaths like I have in the series that I'm working on now, where I have a guy die. And he's kind of a secondary character. But his death didn't mean anything. But in the turn, it didn't mean anything for him, but it meant a lot to the other characters. And so maybe that's a better way to say it. Either it means something for the character, or it means something for the other
It
characters.
needs to be a meaningful death, or the circumstances upon which they die needs to be meaningful. Like they're fighting a battle that needs to be won, then then their death by its very nature is meaningful, even if it like they weren't jumping on a grenade or whatever, just a random bullet killed them. At least they died in a meaningful battle.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it depends. Sometimes you're trying to make a point about the meaninglessness of
True.
Well, and I think that's something, both. True. I'm thinking of examples both Jeff and Rick have done, where you'll have a battle in the midst of like characters moving to contact, especially in space battle, where the distances involved or the volume of fire involved, like half the dropships get taken out, or the ship gets hit by a long range missile or something, and like half these sections get taken out. And you're doing your job, like especially in the case of like Grimm's War, you're doing your job, you don't know what's happening around you, and these things happen, but the effect on the captain is definitely felt. And then later on, like the effects on both Alvarez and Grimm later as they're processing these things is what gives the battle, gives the actions the characters are taking, gives them weight, and I think that emotional punch comes a lot later. But I feel like without it, just had me thinking a lot. The reason I was thinking about this question is I've read other books where it is that Napoleon kind of thing that Josh was mentioning, where waves of people are dying. It's a World War I kind of situation, and just what meaning does that have? Like, you're not giving that, if that's happening and then you don't circle back and look at it from another character's perspective, like, why did you do it, or what is the greater effect on the story?
What were you trying to show? Because a lot of times I think people get lost in the weeds when it comes to battles and things like that, where they're showing the things that aren't important and skipping over the things that are. And one of the things as an author that you have to learn is, because it's almost like your instincts are the opposite of what you should do. Be specific when you need to be specific, and be vague when you need to be vague. And I know for the first half of my career, I had it backwards. I was always specific on things that I didn't need to be specific on, and vague on things I should have been specific on. Blah. So battles are kind of the same way. I know having read Drop Trooper, I know there are situations where hundreds of dropships are coming in on the planet, and there's aircraft artillery, and a bunch of the troopers get killed, just sitting in their ships, and that's definitely realistic, especially for the kind of warfare that's set up. But maybe it's meaningless, but the battle itself is meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
And what
when
they're
I say
doing
meaningless,
is meaningful.
I mean, like you remember when they ran into those female Tawny?
Yeah. Oh yeah. But that still showed something, though. I mean,
that was like the battle's over. He thinks they've made it through, and then these female Tawny come out, warning the men, and they're trying to keep them under control, and one of them has an IED and blows up one of the
Yeah,
troopers.
but I mean, at the same time, that was very illuminating to Alvarez's character. You know what I mean? Like that was, it would be meaningless as if it happened and it didn't change anything for happening.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's senseless for sure.
To the story arc. Yeah.
I mean, it was definitely a senseless death, right? Those people had already lost. There was nothing they had to gain, but it wasn't a meaningless death. And like, you know, I think a lot of times authors.
When you said meaningless originally, I thought you meant like in the more philosophical sense, but you mean to the story arc.
Yeah, to the story. Okay. Yeah, because the thing is like if someone's reading a book and the deaths are meaningless philosophically and to the story, then they don't register, right? But if the deaths have meaning, even if like I said, even if it's not somebody throwing themselves on a grenade, if it's just so and so in compartment 6B dies, it'll be significant if the events around his death are significant or they're emotionally invested in them. So when I remember when that guy died in that book, and he was like, Alvarez was like teaching him to be like his replacement. And it was impactful. It was huge. You know, and so whenever you kill characters off, sure, you can do things like David does this and I do this, where it's like, I say David, like, you know, we're like buddies or whatever, but David Weber, you know, the ship will take a hit and it's a bad hit. And, you know, we'll describe the number of crew who died, you know, on that part of the ship without like, you know, you don't like publish a list of names or whatever. And it sucks because those people died and, you know, theoretically they had families. And if you do your job right, you know, people feel that even though it's like, you know, 26 people died between here and here, including, you know, maybe 2 characters people know.
Well, you feel it through the character though, right?
Yeah.
Like, you don't, like the reader doesn't have a personal investment in that, in the deaths in and of themselves, but because they impact the character that they're reading them through. You know, it's like trying to find or feel empathy for red shirts in Star Trek, because even the command crew doesn't, you know, let's say half a dozen red shirts die on an away mission, like there's no impact there. No one even cares.
That's not true.
That's something that's always bugged me, not just in Star Trek, but in some military science fiction, is that people that are not part of the plot die and nobody really comments on it. But if somebody who's part of the plot arc dies, and everybody just loses their crap and cries and everything. Well, what about these other people who, although they're not part of, you know, the story you're telling, it's not unrealistic that these other characters knew them and were friends with them and should have some kind of reaction to their death.
Well, I think that's a thing that's changed over time as well. Like you think about the 60s when Star Trek, I mean, it should have been.
Okay, I will point out, defensive toss, there were episodes where Red Shirt would die and Kirk would like I knew his father in the academy or I helped him get into Starfleet. You know what I mean? There was often an acknowledgement of,
alas, poor Red Shirt. I knew him, Horatio.
Yeah. So I mean, you know, I know the sense is that red shirts die and, you know, that's it. But in the reality of it is if you've watched every episode multiple times like I have, you'll find that oftentimes Kirk does acknowledge the death of the person. It's not just like continue on the story. But I understand what you're saying, where like, why did this, it's like on TV shows where the vigilante will kill like 50 of the thugs to get to the main bad guy and then he'll let the bad guy live because I'm better than that.
Right.
Yeah.
What about the 54 bastards you just killed, you know? Arrow was terrible about that. Arrow did that all the time.
That's actually a really good point about like death, even if it's the main, if it's actually like a killing and not just a death. I mentioned him several times before on the podcast, but the Gray Man, he had a scene in this book that I'm reading right now. That I'm going through the series a second time, and there's so many parts in the books that I don't remember from the first time I read them. But he basically captures these 3 grunts, you know, foot soldiers, and he tells them that if they tell him what he wants to know, that he's going to love them, he'll show them mercy. And then at the end of the scene, he kills all of them by shooting them in the head. And I'm like,
Reminds me
that
of
makes
Archer.
sense for his character, right? Like he's not going to leave witnesses. He's not going to leave an avenue for them to warn the people that he's coming or anything like that. And that makes sense for his character. And if your character is a cold-blooded killer going through, like you said, like John Wick going through a whole bunch of people, killing them to get to where he's going, he's not going to let the bad guy live. Like that's just not going to sit with his character.
John
Yeah.
Wick is a good example of, I just got tired of it. Like I haven't even finished the fourth movie because I just got tired of watching.
I never watched the third one. The second one wore me out. I was like,
Yeah.
I'm not
I
interested
didn't
in
like
this
the second
anymore.
one, but the third one was actually pretty good, and the fourth one, about
I
halfway
mean,
through the fourth one, I was
it's
like, okay, we need
possible.
to wrap this up now.
It's possible the third one was good, but
It was.
I couldn't bring myself to watch it after number
Yeah.
two. I just
Yeah.
like I'm not interested in this anymore.
The and that brings up a certain point. The reason why I feel like a lot of people didn't like number two as much as they like number one is that number two, they lost something of the moral high ground that he was on in the first one.
Well, he lost the groundedness of the thing
Yeah.
too. I mean, he was like a really kick butt assassin who was really good, but in number two, everybody became superheroes and supervillains.
And also there was a precision element in number one, where in number two, like there's a scene where he's like running through a mall, just randomly shooting at a guy that is shooting at him. And like we were watching that scene and I was just like, that's not how we would have approached that situation at all, you know? And that, you know, that brings up a good point of like, you know, mind your surroundings. Because when you're writing a book and, you know, say you're shooting at a planet, you know, planets are big empty balls of rock in space, but odds are if you're shooting at something on the planet, it's not. So, you know, if you fire a railgun round at the surface, you know, the character is probably going to think some way about that. I had a scene in one of the books where we had to the officer, the weapons officer had to shoot at a freighter. He ended up having to destroy it, and you know he had to come to terms with the fact that, you know, he killed the freighter crew. You know, he pushed the button, and yeah, they were dangerous and they were going to destroy the ship, and you know, or could have. But at the same time, there's a big difference between, you know, I'm shooting at somebody who's shooting at me, who's also in the military, and I'm going to blow up this civilian ship because, you know, they're going to shoot at us and stuff like that. So
it's like a great scene out of Battlestar Galactica that does basically the same principle, where he's got to shoot down a passenger liner because it's got a nuke on it.
Yeah. And
in
people
ROTC,
are going to feel a way about that.
We had to read this book of essays, and one of them that's always jumped out at me as being kind of banal, I guess, but one of the phrases in there was that an officer is educated in the measured application of violence. And I always think about that, the measured application of violence. But that, you know, that's the job as the author. And then also, like, what is a moral, if you think about that in killing people, like the moral application of war, or moral war law, like I won't use more violence or destructive power than necessary. You know, I will try to minimize death even among the enemy if I can. And like things like that in the story.
That's the kind of thing that goes out the window in an all-out war pretty quick. I mean, I've had people make accusations or guesses or whatever of what the war with the Tani and in the Drop Trooper series is based on, but it's really based more than anything else on the war in the Pacific in World War II. And you know what happened in the war in the Pacific? Dehumanization, you know, mass killings of civilians, killings of prisoners. It's just, you know, it was the worst case scenario for humans to fight each other. I mean, not just the nature of the Japanese Empire, but also the places you were fighting, the difficulties with taking care of prisoners or getting them back to the lines. It was just, you know, a horrible situation. And a lot of people killed Japanese soldiers that might have been surrendering, you know, maybe not, you know, you never knew if they were actually surrendering or if one of them had a grenade. I tried to put that into the first 4 books of the Drop Trooper series, you know, in the war, was like when they, there was the scene in book 3, I think it is, where a bunch of Tawny rear echelon types were holding civilians hostage to keep from being bombarded. And then when the Marines invaded, they executed them all. And then they tried to surrender because by that point they knew that the humans would take them prisoner. But this time, when the Marines saw what they'd done, they just started blasting all the surrendering.
Well, I think that's a good, I haven't gotten far enough to know if this gets, where you go with it. But the fact that the Tani are vaguely human, like, just keeps playing with people's morals. Like, should we just execute them all? Like, if they were, plant people or, spores or something, like, we feel no problems just destroying them all. But because we keep thinking like they're slightly like us, like, we feel bad or the reader feels bad, and the characters feel something. I'm not gonna say they feel bad, but they feel about what they're doing, which I think amplifies their humanity, which is a big thing to remember. Like, what, we've talked about having characters die, but I guess this plays into how your characters are executing violence or what they're doing when they kill the enemy. It really speaks about them and who they are. What are they and how the reader's going to feel about it. Some things coming out of, like, people want that kind of power fantasy, and it can also go the other way where you've got a character that feels like terrible about everything. Like, I'm not going to do my job and nobody's evil. I can't. What's that?
Woe is me.
Woe is me, right. And I think that people come to military science fiction to feel justified in this is a story about a justified war doing the things that need to be done, and you're just going to make the reader feel bad if you beat them over the head with that.
Right.
But people should be real as well. Like, this is serious business, and you should be serious. People should be serious about what they're doing. At least that's the stuff that I enjoy more of. I don't like Star Wars kind of things where we're just killing stormtroopers and they're falling off ledges, and that just has no real consequence. I mean, when they made the stormtroopers clones, it was like even worse for me, because it was like, oh, they don't matter at all. And then we make Finn, like, oh, we finally get to humanize the stormtrooper, and then he doesn't even matter. So that kind of thing just doesn't hit for me.
And it's never like Finn went on to try to talk the other stormtroopers out of their conditioning, and it's like, oh, I'm gonna kill them too, now that I got my armor on.
Yep.
There was so much they could have done with that character that they just
they screwed the character and the actor over big time.
yeah.
And the audience.
Like in Drop Trooper, I don't really get into as much the personalization of the enemy, because it's not a situation where he would talk to a lot of them, since he's an NCO and then a low-ranking officer, and he's also in a unit that is in armor and not, sneaking around. There's not a lot of opportunity to interact with the enemy. But if you read a couple of the other series that I wrote in that universe, particularly the Recon series, the main character is trapped behind enemy lines on a planet that's been conquered by the Tani, and he has to deal with them on a one-on-one level and decide whether or not he should treat them as people. And he's also involved in organizing the civilian militia to be like a guerrilla force. And some of those people who've had their relatives killed by the Tani are much less concerned with the laws of war than he is, and it leads to a lot of friction. And then they have to try to turn one of the Tani officers against his people and get him to turn traitor. And I think that more than anything, that one book shows the differences between their civilization and ours. And I tried very hard to make it not just like another historical, society. I tried to make it something that's kind of alien to us. Don't know if I succeeded or not, but I think how the enemy looks on the death of their own soldiers, on killing us, or the POV characters, is also important as how the POV character, and his good side feel about killing the enemy.
No, I think that's important. Yeah.
I think like you said, looking at I think we've talked about it before, where the bad guys they're only concerned with taking out the good guys, like fulfilling their plan or whatever, and the evil general is just, he doesn't care about his troops, and he's just throwing them in the grinder. And I much would rather read a story where the antagonist force is as equally concerned about their own troops as we would like to think that the protagonist forces are, even though I know that there are situations where, you know, commanders are forced to send people in where they know they're going to die. But I think that you can take that approach with both the antagonist force and the protagonist force in a way that makes sense for both sides, because I don't know that there really is a situation where a force is not going to care about the troops that they're sending into the line of fire. I know that there have been battles like that, but I those aren't. I think
British
it's way
generals
more
in World War
interesting.
One were famous for not caring about whether their soldiers lived or died.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and it's really hard to empathize with that kind of character. And so
Yeah.
if you can figure out a way to have the reader empathize with the antagonist force, either the commander or the troops or whatever it is, that makes much for a much more dramatic and interesting read, than them just being faceless enemy bad guys.
It also helps if I do a mix, you know, I mean, I don't have like one kind of antagonist over and over again. Sometimes the antagonist is relatable. Sometimes they're mustache twirling, you know, evil bad guys, because people like that exist.
Right.
But I will say the ones where the antagonist is more relatable, you can actually get people to care about them when they die, even though they're the quote unquote bad guy. Because you have like your antagonist, and then you have obstacles to your antagonist. And you know, I find it much easier to make the obstacles relatable than the actual antagonists, because a lot of times when you have two sides at odds, we all like to think that there's, you know, oh, everybody has good reasons for doing what they're doing and whatever. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're just, you know, evil or power hungry or want territory or want to kill as many people as they can. And the obstacles, which aren't necessarily people driving the bad guys, but are at the mercy of the bad guys, but, you know, are doing their job, it's really easy to make those relatable too, because everybody can relate to somebody who's just doing their job. You know, we talking about World War II, we talk about the Wehrmacht, you know, the just the poor soldiers who were, you know, fighting for their country. They weren't Nazis. They weren't working in the camps. They weren't the what is it, the
special forces or whatever, or what SS you mean?
the Panzer Elites, you know,
Right.
I mean, yeah, the SS Panzer Elite. They were just soldiers, you know. In some cases, though somewhat rare, you know, Americans, because they had come over from Germany, and we have a huge German
I think
population in this country.
even more than that, in World War One, you could see that dichotomy, because despite what the propaganda said in World War One, there was nothing really morally better about one side than the other in that war.
Yeah, everybody agreed to start a war and then blame Germany.
Yeah. I mean, Germany was a militaristic type society, but so were a lot of different ones back then. And you know, there was nothing more imperialistic about their imperial designs than there was about France or England. You know, they all wanted control of other countries.
The more I learn about history, the more I realize that France and England are butthurt about not being empires anymore. And most of their decisions over the last 100 years revolve around that. And especially after World War II, when France lost everything, you know, they immediately invaded Vietnam, and they immediately invaded all these other countries trying to get them back. It's just like the hubris to be completely defeated in a war, and then before the year that you're liberated is even done, you're invading somebody else.
They could be coming out on top of Germany.
They got bullied. They got bullied, so they wanted to bully somebody else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Getting back to death though of main characters. I have to agree that it does bug me when that's done for shock value. I don't mind it if you need to show that anybody can die in a war. Yeah, you might have to kill off a main character, because that is necessary sometimes if you don't want people to think you're writing like a space opera adventure without any stakes.
Right.
Then somebody that means something to the reader is going to
Has
have
to
to die
die.
at some point. But the way they die, the circumstances, the effects on other characters should be significant. It shouldn't be something you take lightly, like, oh, they died, and you show it off screen.
Right.
And I mean, although it happens in war, I don't like it. I don't like it in movies. I don't like it in books. When somebody's kind of just sitting there and they get sniped from some faceless sniper, 1,000 yards away, and then they're just dead. I mean, that happens in war. But if you're talking about a main character who you've invested a lot of time in, I just feel like you should do something more momentous, more significant to the plot than that. Like Jeff was saying, the females with the IED, that wasn't like them throwing themselves on a grenade, but it advanced the growth of the main character. It showed you the nature of the war. I felt like it was a lot.
It was an important moment.
Yeah,
Well, it
was a lot
showed you
better than
something about the
having-
Tawny threat too. Like
Yeah.
that was
Like better than having somebody just killed by a sniper from
Right.
a mile away and they never see him. Oh, it's the meaninglessness of war. Yeah, but I'm investing my time to read this book. I want something better than that.
right.
Yeah, for sure. I had a character die a couple books ago, and I did what I thought was a fairly interesting way, and it had a huge impact on the crew. I don't want to give any spoilers because it's only 2 books ago. Had a huge impact on the crew because of the way he died. And it was a character who'd been in the book series since the beginning. And while he was never a main character, he was a main supporting character. And cat.
Nice.
I ended up, toward the end of the book, and what I ended up writing was how devastated Jacob was about this kid dying, because it was essentially right in front of him. And
See, I liked it when the crew cleaned up the chair for the cat, for Grimm. And
yeah,
then, like, we have to do this, we got to take care of him. So that was a good kind of reversal on that.
And it was a big deal. It was momentous, and it was impactful, and it was meaningful. And even though the death itself was not meaningful, like he didn't die in a meaningful way. He didn't like that one corporal. He didn't jump on a grenade. He just was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
I would argue that the ship, the safety of the ship was compromised, and so in a way it demonstrated that no one's safe inside the ship. Like a lot of times the threat is coming from outside in that perspective.
I mean, the circumstances had meaning, but the death itself, for him wasn't meaningful.
Mhm.
So I mean, that's what we're talking about is like you can show the senselessness of war without randomly killing characters in a way that makes no impact on the plot. It has to have an impact on the plot, or why are you doing it?
There have to be
It's like the old rule
consequences.
about writing scenes, right? It should move the story forward and illuminate character.
That's like the one thing that comes to mind for me in Wholesale Slaughter. There was a character. He was the captain of the ship. He was like a mercenary. Started out the series as kind of a roguish type guy, but eventually started caring about their cause and kind of being loyal to the main character. So he has a Quint type story of Quint with the life jackets and the sharks. Well, he was in a battle.
1,100 men went into the sea.
Yeah,
300 came out.
This guy was in a battle where it went on for days, a space battle, and everybody was stuck inside their suits because the hull integrity was gone. And you had people who their suits went bad, and they just died in their suit because of lack of oxygen, or you had others who the heating or cooling elements went bad and they froze to death or broiled inside their suits. And he's like, he refuses to put on a spacesuit during a battle, whether or not, if the ship gets hulled, he's just going to die. Or in the very end, the very last battle, he has his suit on, but won't put his helmet on until the very last second, and in this battle, he basically sacrifices himself and winds up dying the way those people went just before his ship is saved by somebody else. But yeah, I thought, you want to make it a significant character death meaningful with a long backstory that feeds into it. I mean, it may not be him throwing himself on a grenade, like you said, but it should be something that's been built up to, I think, in the plot. It shouldn't come as like, I mean, it should be a surprise, but it shouldn't be
It's
something
inevitable.
yeah, it shouldn't be something when people read it that they can't look back and see, oh yeah, this was being built up to, and I just didn't see it at the time.
I had in the last book, I had a character almost die, and a lot of people asked me like, well, did you chicken out? Or I was like, no, I didn't have time in the book to allocate to her, to give her, give the death the appropriate, weight it needed, and because it was just something that happened at the end, a ship crashed and the person was in it, and I kind of faked people out. They thought she was dead, and then she was, in the end, in that blog, she was alive, and in a believable way, I think. And but I'm not going to kill a character off. I'm not going to bring in, especially a character that's like a fan favorite or a main character, so to speak. Bring them in for one chapter and then kill them. The focus of the book has got to be about that.
Yeah, if you don't spend at least part of your book delving into that character and giving them meaning to the reader, then killing them off is not going to affect the reader. It's not going to.
Why'd you have them there in the first place?
Yeah. What's so funny is I was talking to Brandon Ellis the other day, and man, you talk about a dude who gets bad advice from everybody. He was asking me about how to make characters relatable and in the military. He's like, because I know they're not supposed to show emotion or have emotions, and I'm like, who told you that? Who's lying to you, man?
Terminator.
It's like, people in the military as officers might have a better control over their emotions than, say, a 19-year-old private, but only barely. The emotions are how you relate to characters. If you don't write characters with emotions, then you're not writing a book, you're writing a screenplay. And I know a lot of people who want to write movies, but they can't, so they write novels instead. But you have three things in a book. You have what people see, what people think, and how people feel. And to voluntarily remove one of those is literary suicide. Well, and how people feel is what we're talking about, right? Because death is all about feeling.
Well, it's one of the misconceptions that a lot of people have about the military is that they're the people in uniform are just mindless killing machines,
right? Robotic baby killers.
That's I
missed that class.
Yeah. Well, there are some that are like that, and not to that like black extent, but that they have developed a kind of attitude towards their work. For instance, a special operator who's been in several combat situations will have a much different outlook on killing than a infantry grunt where he's in his first engagement. That it's not that this special operator is a mindless killing machine, but he's kind of insulated himself through those emotions, and he deals with it in a different way. The same way that officers deal with death. A commanding officer that's not on scene might deal with death differently than the guy that's standing right next to the dude that gets shot in the face. And I think that if you're not going to put emotion into your book, you're missing out. Like you said, you're missing out on one of the three barstool legs of like necessity, making the reader care about the story.
Yeah. And I've heard other writers say that they've been given that advice by beta readers or by editors. There's too much emotion in this book. You need to take this emotion out. And I'm like, who are these people? Because they're not people who read books.
Well,
all we have is how people feel.
They watch John Wayne movies from the 50s and about World War II and think that's how people act.
Well, and that's the problem is you do not learn to write novels by watching movies.
Yeah.
You learn to write novels by reading good novels, and reading bad ones, but mostly good ones.
Well, even those special operator stereotypes that have come out of, global war and terrorism, I think a lot of people have seen those stories and think that's how it all is. And even for those operators, like we've talked about that before, like they come up with coping mechanisms to process the emotions they feel, because that's what a person does. Are they going to tear themselves apart? You know, that could be part of an, if they don't do that, that could be an arc that turns them into, you know, a psychopath. But that's part of the consequence of what makes these stories, you know, real. And I think makes, you know, elevates a certain story where a character is dealing with the actual consequences and impacts of killing, you know, of people dying. And I guess that's also, as I'm thinking about this, one of the big differences between, you know, I've heard science fiction writers say, like, I want to imagine a future where there is no more violence, or there is no more, you know, maybe we think
Well, that's
about
an easy future to imagine. All humanity has been destroyed.
Well, I mean,
it's like it's like that Saturday Night Live guy. I imagine a planet where there is no war, there is no violence, and I imagine us invading that planet because they'd never expected.
What is that? Handy. I gotta.
Yeah.
Those were the best. Anyway, but that's,
I can't remember the guy's name.
When we think about, you know, human nature and war being a part of human nature throughout our history, and maybe the ways that, and that we've talked about this too, like the ways we conduct war may change, but that as long as humans disagree about things, people are going to get killed. I don't know. Like that is the ultimate consequence. That is the ultimate expression of I want to do this and you don't. And having that have meaning, I think is part of what these stories are helping people figure out. What that could look like in the future, or how we process it with what we know today versus what we imagine. I don't know. I think it's part of what military science fiction is doing. And so to me, I like to see
Deep Thoughts with Jack Handley. That's what it was.
That's it. I wanted to say J.R. Handy. I'm like, maybe that's why his name has always like struck with me, because Jack Handy.
Well, it's the differentiation between like the act itself, and then the you know, if you've got a mindless killing machine like we're talking about, then they'll just kill everybody. But if you have an actual person that's doing a mission, you know, you have those situations where you're going in and I think Jeff, you mentioned at the beginning of the show, where you have like a civilian population, you can't just go indiscriminately shooting people. And so if you've got characters that are soldiers and they've got like moral compass and they're, you know, they're generally good or whatever, they're not just going to be wasting civilians. So if you're having a firefight, like you said in the mall with John Wick, and they're just shooting everything, that's not going to happen. It's going to elevate the tension because they're not going to want to shoot civilians. You know, and that also can elevate a death where he shoots a civilian and that negatively affects him, or negatively affects his career. And those are really good elements to have in a story. Now, obviously you can't do everything at the same time. You've got to have certain situations happen in different places, but you know, if you have that thing going on, and maybe he is an operator that can do the killing, but if he accidentally kills a civilian, that is going to really affect him more than it would if he's just shooting an enemy soldier. And that type of character breakdown is really important if you're wanting to show some kind of negative emotion in that character in terms of killing, because that's a great way to handle it, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, it's just there are very few actual psychopaths. I mean, very few.
For sure.
And there's nobody who gets out of the military who doesn't have PTSD, whether it be from being in firefights or killing people or being shot at or whatever, or just not being shot at. Just the military life itself lends to mental distress.
Right.
You know, just ask the veteran to be late sometime and, you know, watch them freak out. And so it's important, though, to remember that...
Or to be just right on time.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's important to remember that there are very few people in the military who are just like mindless killing machines and can just do whatever. And you know, most of this, we talk about this like it's really important, and it is, but it's also from an author's perspective and a reader's perspective. You have to remember, we're talking about a sentence or two. Just a sentence that says he didn't want to have to kill anybody else because he'd had his fill, you know, or something to that effect. And, you know, and that's a nod to it. And, you know, you don't need you don't need to go into depth. You don't need a big, you know, monologue about what was me. I knew him well kind of thing. So just remember when you're writing these things that it's important to show the whole picture and to give us well-rounded characters to die. And when they do die, you know, make sure the circumstances are meaningful or the death is meaningful. And it should impact the people around him or her, and not, and not just be just a blip on the radar. And
Well, that's a
that
great
also-
distinction to make. Is it meaningful to the character, or is it meaningful to the plot, or
Yeah.
both? Because you can have different meanings in the death, but it definitely has to have meaning.
There has to be some meaning. I know I've got a scene at one point where Jacob was looking over a list of people's names, and someone asked him what it is, and he's like, "It's all the people I've lost." So he's never without that burden.
Right.
The horrible privilege of command is what he calls it. The terrible privilege of command.
I think that it's also important, especially in military science fiction, that the enemy, I mean, it depends on what you're writing, but I mean, the enemy, the main character might develop a hesitance to kill the enemy if they're like us, or if, he begins to see them as like us. So it might, I read a lot of military science fiction where it starts up with the enemy being faceless, non-inhuman, and then as it goes on, they learn more about them and they become more relatable. But, if they're not human looking, it may be a long time before any of the main characters decide, I don't want to kill them. If they look like bugs, it might be a lot easier for them.
Why not kill a bug?
Yeah, why not kill
I
them?
know. Well, I mean, that's a human fallacy, right? Like we project humanity onto things as a way to relate to them. And so as you get to know your enemy, you start to appreciate or see things in them that other people might not. And it's like an enemy mind kind of situation. But go ahead, Josh.
I did that with the last thing I'll say is I did that with Strikers War, in that the main characters are there to basically squash a rebellion, and so they have different engagements with insurgents, and we build them up as this kind of a terrorist group almost, and then at the end of the book you kind of figure out like why they are fighting back and why they are insurgents, and for the insurgents themselves, it is a very meaningful reason, and it gives weight to why they're doing it. It gives empathy to their circumstance, even though you're still kind of rooting for the main character, and that's important too.
I had a scene in one of the books where Jacob takes an enemy captain. They're in a system that has a black hole, and you can't stay there. You either have to be moving or away from it or toward it, but you can't stay there, otherwise you'll eventually get sucked in. And the enemy ship's propulsion gets destroyed. And he tells them, he's like, "Listen, just surrender. I'll bring you over to my ship. We'll all get out of here." And the guy ends up surrendering, and even though they're not supposed to, but he didn't want to throw away the lives of his men when it came down to it. And when he came on the ship, he spoke English. And Jacob realized in that moment he didn't speak a word of Caliph. And so it was like, oh, and he lives by Sun Tzu, right? Know thy enemy is the name of the book. And in the books after that, he started to learn the language because he felt like he didn't understand the enemy if he couldn't speak their language. Something to think about.
One of my favorite parts of, I think it was the first Jurassic Park, when the guys, fighting the velociraptors and they sneak around on him and get him, and he's like, "Oh, clever girl." And it's like, it's like, oh, he respects his enemy, and his enemy got the best of him, and now he's going to die. So
there was a good tie-in too, because in the beginning of the movie, that's exactly what Alan said they did, and so the guy didn't know his enemy. Alan did, but he didn't. So I thought that was great. Sorry.
Good closure.
No, it was good.
Yeah.
Way to wrap it up.
Speaking of closure,
I know we should probably wrap it up. Thank you. This was a good conversation. I appreciate it. So thank you for hanging out with us. And if you haven't, check out our Discord, and I will try to make sure the link is correct in YouTube. It keeps updating the link and hiding it for some reason. So if it doesn't work for you, just let us know in the comments, because we'd love to hear what you think about this topic as well. Like what's a really bad or disappointing death, and what was a great death that maybe you still think about in a story you read. We'd like to hear about it. So
don't forget to check out our latest books. I know Rick's got World War Mars has come out. Is it book 3 out yet, or is it book 2?
Oh, book 3's been out for a while.
Yeah. And then this is my latest one, Traditions of Command. And Josh, I know you're working on one.
It's close. It's close.
Close. They're all close.
Yeah.
Yep. And then 3 of us are working on some stories for an anthology that I actually don't know the release date on that, but it's called Express Elevator to Hell.
Well, the
and
deadline
down.
the deadline for the stories to be submitted is like September 30th. So I
Yeah.
imagine the release date will be a couple months.
I imagine I'll be writing mine on September 30th.
So we need to release our aliens episode, because we did a great aliens episode. So
Yeah.
yep.
No, yeah, that was a fun episode. We gotta do more of that. I don't know, are you guys gonna see Romulus?
No.
Yes.
Maybe.
No.
Romulus
Yeah.
looks like it's going back to the feeling of like the first Alien, but then also combining some good character from Aliens.
I don't trust.
So I'm excited.
I
for
don't
it.
trust the franchise.
Yeah, I don't
haven't-
trust.
I
I know.
haven't since Aliens 3, so I'm not gonna watch it.
Watch our aliens episode, which will be coming
Yes.
out next week, James. Right?
We'll do
Right?
it next week. Yep, that sounds good.
And then
Well,
you'll know our thoughts on it.
so I'll have to do this episode now and then aliens next. So we'll get it worked out. All right. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to y'all later.